Reece Sunclades, and I'm going to be talking today about Sperry's split brains, Roger Sperry, to be specific. I'm going to start off with a quote by George Pugh. If the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. But hey, that hasn't stopped people from trying, right? I'm going to talk about brain mapping starting at 1996 and going roughly until right about now. We'll briefly go over Franz Joseph Gall, Phineas Gage, and Paul Broca, and spend a little bit more time talking about Roger Sperry and the Nobel Prize work that he did in the area, along with a little bit of current brain mapping. Franz Joseph Gall was a Viennese physician who developed phrenology, which is an important part in cortical localization in the history of it. He developed it in 1796, and it gained popularity in the early 1800s. Around 1840, roughly, it fell out, but it gained popularity because it was conveniently used to justify institutionalized racism. And around 1840, it was dismissed as non-scientific, but hey, you got points for trying, right? So, moving on to Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and he had an accident with a tamping rod, which he's pictured with here, where he was packing explosives when he was working on the railroad, and then he packed it too tightly, and they ignited and sent that rod through his face and out the top of his skull, and sent a teacup's worth of brain matter just flying. And after this, he actually survived. He survived for 12 years, and his personality had changed dramatically. Beforehand, he was a very well-adjusted individual, but afterwards, he became very short-tempered, very aggressive, and quick to anger. People say this is because of the brain damage to the parts of the brain that was responsible for his personality, and it supported cortical localization. But if you're asking me, maybe it's just because he got half his face blown off. That would really ruin my day for a long time. Moving on to Pierre-Paul Broca, who was a French physician. He worked with the patient Tan, the one who had a brain lesion as a result of illness in this area of the left hemisphere of the brain. If you take human anatomy, this is actually called Broca's area. It's the speech center of the brain. And Tan was the patient who could understand everything, but he couldn't communicate at all other than saying Tan, which was very interesting, very important. And moving on to the man himself, Roger Sperry. Up to this point, we've only been able to study the brain through people who have like injuries or illnesses or lesions, and we haven't been able to really study healthy human brains. So what he did is he was the first one to do studies on healthy human brains, where he did his studies from 1958 to 1968. He worked with epileptic patients that were having their corpus callosum, the band of fibers in between their left and right hemispheres of the brain. They had that severed to treat their epilepsy, and he just went and he sought out these people. So it was a very convenient sample that he could use to do his studies on cortical localization. These people were actually very functioning after this surgery. They were in very high spirits because they weren't suffering massive grand mal seizures anymore. So they were actually in a good mood. And one of them even, I swear, one dad joke of the year, because when he was working with Roger Sperry, and Sperry asked him, "How are you doing today?" He said, "I'm doing fine, except for this splitting headache." Terrible. But very important, because he was first to be able to ethically do research on healthy human brains to identify which hemisphere controlled what. He did a lot of experiments, and they had a lot of similar methodology, but an example of the methodology is he would have his patients stare at a point in the center, and then he would have a light flash in the left visual field, and then he would have a light flash in the right visual field. And he would say, "How many lights did you see?" And then he'd say, "I only saw one light." And then he'd say, "Okay, I'm going to do the same thing again. This time point to the lights when you see them. Light flash, point. Light flash, point. How many lights did you see?" You pointed to 2. I only saw 1 light. So from this, he was able to garner that the right hemisphere of the brain isn't blind. It can still see, because he was still able to point to the left light. It just can't talk about what it can see, which is very interesting. And moving on, this is another example of the same thing. When he would show the word face in the right hemisphere, or in the right visual field, people will be able to say, "Hey, I saw the word face," because it goes to the left hemisphere of the brain, which is where Broca's area is. And then when it was shown the left hemisphere, or left visual field, they asked what they saw nothing. But they were able to draw with their left hand what they saw. So this supports that the right hemisphere of the brain isn't blind, it just can't talk. Moving on, one thing that the right hemisphere of the brain that he found was more accurate, or was better at than the left hemisphere of the brain, was spatial construction. He took right-handed patients and just asked them to simply recreate a cube or draw a cross. And they were almost completely, as you can see, incapable of drawing any sort of spatial construction. But he took the same people who were right-handed and had them draw these cubes and images with their left hand, and he found out that they actually do a lot better. Therefore, the spatial construction center of the brain is located in the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, moving forward, his studies, even though they got a Nobel Prize, won him a lot of criticism because it resulted in pop psychology. I'm pretty sure you guys have seen a post like this in your new, Facebook news feed. Like, oh look, I'm 60% right-brained and 40% left-brained. I knew it. Those who know me knew it. Believe it or not, 100% of you are 100% left-brained, and 100% of you are 100% right-brained. 100% of the brain is important, and it is 100% used all the time. Sorry. Jerry Levy is one researcher who's trying to counter this misinformation and try and set the public perception right. Moving into modern day brain mapping, with the advent of modern technology, we've been able to take a look inside the human brain without actually harming someone or opening it up at all using brain scans. Raymond Damadian was the first to invent the MRI machine, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging. He did the first human body scan in 1977. What an MRI machine does is it uses magnetic waves to very slightly change the orientation of the hydrogen in your brain, and then it uses radio waves to pick up on this change in the orientation, and it uses that to get a picture over here. And oftentimes a contrast is injected into the patient in order to highlight certain areas depending on what they're looking for in the scan. So what you can do is you can inject a contrast into a person, present them with a stimulus, and then you can see increases in blood flow in certain areas of the brain, which can show brain activation. So you can present someone with a stimulus while their brain is in the MRI machine and track what their brain is doing in real time. And that's how we've been mapping the human brain ever since. Here's my references. Any questions?
It's not a question, but that was really well done.
Thanks. Practice. Yeah.
Now that we're able to map the brain in that way, do we use the split brain patients anymore? Do they still split the corpus callosum?
The corpus callosum split is used to limit the effect of grand mal seizures in very severe epilepsy patients, because basically the epileptic seizures can't transfer from one side of the brain to the other. That's the only time, and it's got to be really, really severe, like to the point where it's crippling your life. But Jerry Levy is a graduate student of Sperry's. She's doing the research that's trying to counter the whole left brain, right brain pop psychology thing. She's currently doing research with split brain patients still in trying to dispel the mystique of pop psychology stuff. Go ahead.
Okay. So do you think that the Sperry's research was, you had kind of talked about some criticisms that happened because of all of the pop psychology, but right away when he did it, there wasn't, I don't think that pop psychology came up right away, kind of came up kind of later. So was the research sort of accepted at the time initially, or was it just sort of ignored, or what happened right away after he started doing research?
Well, he won a Nobel Prize right away. So
in the scientific community it was...
Scientific community, it was accepted.
How about in the general public?
I don't think so. I think it only became popular as a way to come up with pop psychology and Facebook and BuzzFeed quizzes.